Welcome to Myths of the Night. Ancient stories told in whispers to guide you into calm and peaceful rest. Here, the myths of old are retold in calm voices to help you rest, reflect, and dream. Picture the ancient island of Crete, rising from the sapphire waters of the Aegean Sea, its white cliffs gleaming under an endless Mediterranean sun. This was a place where myth and reality intertwined like the threads of fate itself, where palaces sprawled across hillsides with rooms so numerous and passages so bewildering that visitors spoke of them in hushed, wonder-struck tones. In the heart of this legendary island stood the great palace of Naxos, home to King Minos, a ruler whose power stretched across the sea lanes and whose very name inspired both respect and fear throughout the ancient world. But beneath the grandeur of painted columns and elaborate frescoes, beneath the careful diplomacy and displays of wealth, there lurked a secret so dark and so shameful that it had to be hidden away in the deepest recesses of the palace itself. For King Minos harbored within his magnificent halls a creature born of divine punishment and human hubris, a being that embodied the terrible price of offending the gods. This was the Minotaur, a monstrous fusion of man and bull, whose very existence spoke to the complicated relationship between mortals and the divine forces that shaped their destinies. The story of how this creature came to be is itself a tale of divine vengeance and unnatural desire. King Minos, in his pride and ambition, had once prayed to Poseidon, god of the seas, to send him a magnificent white bull as a sign of divine favor. The god obliged, sending forth from the waves a creature of such breathtaking beauty that Minos found himself unable to fulfill his end of the bargain. He was supposed to sacrifice this perfect bull back to Poseidon, acknowledging the god's supremacy and his own role as merely a mortal keeper of divine gifts. But Minos, captivated by the animal's splendor, chose to keep it among his herds, substituting a lesser creature for the sacrifice. Poseidon's rage at this betrayal was swift and terrible. The god did not strike Minos down directly, for that would have been too simple, too merciful. Instead, he crafted a punishment that would haunt the king for the rest of his days and stain his family's honor for generations to come. He caused Pasiphae, Minos' queen and daughter of the sun god Helios, to develop an overwhelming and unnatural passion for the white bull. Consumed by this cursed desire, Pasiphae sought out Daedalus, the legendary craftsman and inventor who served at Minos' court, and begged him to help her satisfy this terrible longing. Daedalus, whose skill with his hands was matched only by his brilliant but sometimes misguided creativity, constructed an elaborate hollow cow made of wood and covered with real cowhide. Inside this contraption, Pasiphae positioned herself and was brought to the pasture where the white bull grazed. The deception worked. And from this unnatural union, Pasiphae conceived and eventually gave birth to a child that was human in body, but bore the head and some characteristics of a bull. They named him Asterion, though he would become known throughout the Greek world by a different name, the Minotaur, which means simply the Bull of Minos. King Minos found himself facing an impossible situation. He could not kill the creature, for it was, after all, his wife's child, with at least some claim to royal blood. Yet he could not allow it to roam free, for as Asterion grew, so too did his strength, his rage, and most troublingly, his appetite for human flesh. The solution, when it came, was as ingenious as it was terrible. Minos again turned to Daedalus and commanded him to construct a prison so complex, so bewildering in its design, that anyone who entered would never find their way out again. This was the origin of the famous Labyrinth of Naxos, a maze of countless passages, dead ends, and twisted corridors that wound beneath the palace floors, like the convolutions of a mad god's mind. The labyrinth served its purpose well, containing the Minotaur in its lightless depths. But the creature had to be fed, and here is where the tale takes an even darker turn. For King Minos, seeking revenge for the death of his son Androgeus in Athens, had conquered that city-state and imposed upon it the most terrible tribute imaginable. Every 9 years, according to most accounts, Athens was required to send 7 young men and 7 young women, chosen from among the noblest families, to be delivered to Crete and sent into the labyrinth as food for the Minotaur. These 14 tributes would be escorted into the maze with no weapons, no thread to guide them back, nothing but their terror and the certainty that they would wander those dark passages until the beast found them and tore them apart with its terrible strength. Imagine the grief that descended upon Athens each time the black-sailed ship arrived to collect its human cargo. Families would clutch their children close, dreading the lots that would be drawn to determine whose sons and daughters would be taken. The city that would later pride itself on democracy and philosophy found itself helpless before the might of Crete, forced to sacrifice its youth to satisfy one king's need for vengeance and another's need to feed an abomination. For the young people of Athens, the very mention of Crete conjured images of darkness, of stone walls that pressed in from all sides, and of something massive and terrible waiting just around the next corner, its breath hot with bloodlust, its hooves striking sparks from the stone floor. This was the world into which Princess Ariadne had been born. She was the daughter of Minos and Pasiphae, which made her, in a sense, the half-sister of the Minotaur, though this relation was not one spoken of openly. She had grown up in the palace, knowing that beneath her feet, in the twisted passages of the labyrinth, her monstrous half-brother prowled and raged. She had seen the tributes arrive from Athens, had watched as they were led away with haunted eyes and trembling steps, knowing they walked toward certain death. Perhaps she had even heard the distant echoes of their screams rising up through the palace foundations when the Minotaur found them. Ariadne was described as exceptionally beautiful, with the kind of loveliness that seemed to carry within it hints of her divine ancestry. Through her mother, Pasiphae, she was granddaughter to Helios himself, the Titan who drove the sun's chariot across the sky each day. Her aunt was the legendary witch Circe, who would one day transform Odysseus's men into swine, and her cousin was Medea, whose own love story with Jason would end in betrayal and terrible vengeance. The women of Ariadne's family were known for the intensity of their passions and the lengths to which they would go for love. It was a legacy that Ariadne would continue in ways she could never have imagined on those quiet days when she walked the palace corridors and gazed out at the sea, wondering perhaps what lay beyond the horizon of her carefully circumscribed world. She had siblings, too, among them her sister Phaedra, who would play her own tragic role in the tangled web of fate that would eventually ensnare them all, and her brother Androgeus, whose death had sparked the terrible tribute from Athens in the first place. The palace of Knossos was a place of secrets and sorrows, where every grand hall and beautiful fresco seemed to hide some darkness, where the laughter at feasts was always shadowed by the knowledge of what lurked below. For Ariadne, growing up in such a place must have been like living in a dream that could turn to nightmare at any moment, where beauty and horror existed side by side, inseparable and eternal. And so the years passed, marked by the regular arrival of the tribute ships, by the procession of doomed young people being led down into darkness, by the knowledge that beneath all the civilization and culture that Crete prided itself on, there was this dark heart, this terrible secret that consumed innocence with the regularity of the seasons. Ariadne had no reason to believe that anything would ever change. She was a princess of Crete, destined perhaps for a political marriage, for a life of comfort and duty. She had no way of knowing that with the arrival of the next tribute ship, her entire world would be transformed, that she would make a choice that would define her forever in legend and song, that she would know both the heights of passion and the depths of despair. But that ship was coming. Even now, it was cutting through the waves toward Crete, its black sails billowing in the wind, carrying among its passengers a young man whose name would echo through history. His name was Theseus, and his arrival would change everything. The arrival of the hero. In Athens, far across the wine-dark sea from Crete, there lived a young man whose life had been marked from birth by destiny and secrets. Theseus was the son of Aethra, daughter of King Pythias of Troezen, and his paternity was a matter of some mystery and divine significance. Some said his father was Aegeus, the aging king of Athens, while others whispered that Poseidon himself, the great earth-shaker and lord of the seas, had visited Aethra on the night of Theseus's conception. Perhaps both stories were true in the way that such things could be true in the age of heroes, when the boundaries between mortal and divine were far more permeable than they would later become. Theseus had been raised in Troezen, in the palace of his grandfather Pythias, far from the intrigues and dangers of Athens. His mother had told him stories of his father, whoever that father truly was. And before leaving Troezen, Aegeus had placed a sword and a pair of sandals beneath a massive boulder, telling Aethra that when their son grew strong enough to lift the stone, he should retrieve these tokens and journey to Athens to claim his birthright. The day came when Theseus, now a young man of remarkable strength and courage, rolled the boulder aside as easily as if it were a pebble. He took up the sword and sandals and set out for his father's city, choosing to travel by the dangerous land route rather than the safer sea voyage, eager to test himself against the bandits and monsters that plagued the roads. And test himself he did. Along the way, he encountered and defeated Periphetes, a murderous robber who killed travelers with an iron club. Theseus took the club for himself and moved on to confront Sinis, known as the Pine Bender, who would bend 2 pine trees to the ground, tie his victims to them, and then release the trees to tear the unfortunate travelers apart. Theseus subjected Sinis to his own method of execution and continued onward. At Crommyon, he slew the monstrous Crommyonian, Sao, and then dealt with Siren, who forced travelers to wash his feet and then kicked them off a cliff into the sea, where a giant turtle devoured them. Theseus threw Siren off his own cliff and journeyed on to face Procrustes, the stretcher who made travelers lie on an iron bed, and then either stretched them or cut off their limbs to make them fit. One by one, Theseus dispatched these villains, making the roads safer for ordinary people and building a reputation as a hero and champion of justice. By the time he arrived in Athens and was acknowledged by his father Aegeus, Theseus had become a young man of considerable fame. He was not merely strong and skilled with weapons, but possessed of a sharp intelligence and a burning desire to prove himself worthy of his lineage, whether mortal or divine. He was handsome, too, with the kind of commanding presence that drew eyes when he entered a room, the physical grace that spoke of his prowess in combat, and the confidence that came from having survived dangers that would have killed lesser men. But for all his strength and accomplishments, Theseus was still young, and youth often brings with it a certain rashness, a tendency to leap before a looking, and an absolute certainty in one's own abilities that can sometimes shade into arrogance. It was during this period, as Theseus was settling into life in Athens and getting to know his father, that the time came once again for the terrible tribute to Crete. The city fell into mourning even before the lots were drawn. Families gathered in homes and temples, praying that their children would be spared, knowing that some parents' prayers would go unanswered. The black-sailed ship that would carry the tributes to their doom sat in the harbor, a dark reminder of Athens' subjugation to Cretan power. King Aegeus, for all his royal authority, was as helpless as any other parent in the city to prevent this tragedy. The terms of the tribute had been agreed to and sealed by oaths to the gods. To break those oaths would bring divine punishment down upon all of Athens. But Theseus, learning of this custom and seeing the grief it brought to his father's city, felt the anger of youth and the confidence of someone who had already defeated every challenge placed before him. He went to his father and announced his intention to volunteer as one of the 7 young men who would be sent to Crete. More than that, he declared that he would enter the Labyrinth, find the Minotaur, and kill it, ending forever the cruel tribute that had hung over Athens like a curse. Aegeus was horrified at this proposal. He had only just found his son after so many years, had only recently been able to acknowledge him publicly as his heir. The thought of losing Theseus to the Minotaur was almost too much to bear. But Theseus was insistent, and eventually Aegeus recognized that he could not stop his son without breaking his spirit. The young hero's reputation among the people of Athens had grown rapidly, and they saw in him a champion who might finally free them from their bondage to Crete. There was one concession that Aegeus managed to extract from his son. The tribute ships always sailed with black sails, a symbol of mourning for the young lives being sent to their deaths. Aegeus made Theseus promise that if he succeeded in killing the Minotaur and survived the Labyrinth, he would have the crew raise white sails on the return journey. That way, Aegeus, watching from the heights above Athens, would know from a distance whether his son lived or had perished in the attempt. Theseus readily agreed to this simple request. How could such a small thing slip his mind? But we who know the end of the story understand that even simple promises can be forgotten in the chaos and emotion that follows great trials, and that the smallest oversight can lead to the most devastating consequences. So it was that Theseus joined the other 6 young men and 7 young women who had been chosen for the tribute. Some accounts say he was selected by lot like the others, but most versions agree that he volunteered, taking the place of another who would have been chosen. The 14 tributes boarded the black-sailed ship, and as the vessel pulled away from the dock, the people of Athens lined the harbor, weeping and calling out farewells. Parents stretched their hands toward the ship, carrying their children away. Siblings cried out names that would soon be nothing but memories. And the whole city seemed to bow under the weight of its collective sorrow. Only Theseus stood at the rail with his head held high, his hand on the hilt of his sword, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Crete waited. He was sailing not to his death, he believed, but to his greatest triumph. The voyage across the Aegean took several days, days in which the tributes had time to contemplate what awaited them. Most of them must have spent those hours in quiet despair, perhaps holding hands with their companions, perhaps weeping, perhaps trying to find some last scraps of courage to face the darkness ahead. But Theseus, according to legend, spent the time encouraging the others, telling them that things would be different this time, that they would all survive and return home to Athens as heroes. Whether the other tributes believed him or simply humored him to ease their own terror, we cannot know. But as the island of Crete grew larger on the horizon, as they began to make out the white buildings of Naxos climbing the hillside, surely even Theseus must have felt some small flutter of doubt. He had faced many dangers, but he had never faced a monster in a labyrinth from which no one had ever escaped. He had never stood in complete darkness with the certain knowledge that something massive and hungry was hunting him through passages without end. The ship entered the harbor at Knossos, and the tributes were led off the vessel in chains. This was not to prevent escape, for where would they escape to on an island surrounded by sea and controlled by Crete's powerful navy? But rather, it was a symbol of their status. They were prisoners, sacrifices, not guests or even enemies worthy of respect. They were sheep being led to slaughter, and their chains announced this to everyone who saw them. The people of Crete lined the route from the harbor to the palace, and their reactions varied. Some looked away, uncomfortable with this display, but unwilling to speak against it. Others stared with callous curiosity or even satisfaction, seeing these Athenians as nothing more than what they were: payment for old debts, food for a monster that protected Crete by its very existence. The tributes walked through this gauntlet of eyes, their heads held as high as they could manage, their terror kept, for the most part, locked away behind faces trying desperately to maintain some shred of dignity. And then they entered the palace, that sprawling complex of rooms and corridors, of painted frescoes showing dolphins leaping through stylized waves, of elegant columns that tapered downward in the distinctive Minoan style. They were brought before King Minos himself, who sat in judgment, cold and terrible in his authority. The king surveyed these young people who had been sent to satisfy his need for vengeance, and perhaps he felt some small stirring of pity. Or perhaps he felt nothing at all. It is hard to imagine what thoughts passed through the mind of a man who could condemn innocence to such a fate year after year. But kings must make terrible decisions, and Minos had made his. He spoke the ritual words that condemned them to the labyrinth, and the guards prepared to lead them away to the cells where they would spend their last night before being sent into the maze. But something happened before they were led away, something that none of them could have predicted, something that would change everything. Among the royal family gathered to witness the presentation of the tributes stood Princess Ariadne. And when her eyes fell upon Theseus, when she saw this young man standing taller and more defiant than the others, when their gazes locked for just a moment across that great hall, something shifted in the world. It was one of those moments that myths are made of, when the gods themselves seem to hold their breath, when fate reaches down and takes hold of two lives and binds them together with threads invisible but unbreakable. Some would say it was Aphrodite working her will, inflaming Ariadne's heart with impossible passion for this stranger. Others would say it was simple human attraction, the magnetic pull that sometimes exists between two souls when they recognize something in each other that resonates with their own deepest nature. Whatever the cause, Ariadne felt herself falling in love with remarkable, terrifying speed. This was not the mild affection or political fondness that might have been arranged for her eventual marriage. This was a consuming, all-encompassing passion that struck her like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and dizzy and utterly transformed. In that moment, seeing Theseus standing in chains but unbroken, she knew with absolute certainty that she could not let him walk into the labyrinth to die. She could not stand by and watch this young hero be devoured by her monstrous half-brother. She could not live with herself if she did nothing, while everything in her screamed out for her to act, to save him, to keep this flame she had just discovered from being extinguished in the darkness below the palace. But acting on such feelings would require betraying everything she had ever known. It would mean turning against her father, against her country, against the very order of the world as she understood it. It would mean using her knowledge and her position to undermine the tribute that had been imposed upon Athens, potentially bringing down her father's wrath upon her own head. And yet, as she watched Theseus being led away, as she felt the intensity of emotions she had never experienced before, Ariadne knew that she would do it. Love, especially the fierce, sudden love of legend, does not calculate costs or consider consequences. It simply acts and accepts whatever price must be paid. The princess had made her choice, though Theseus did not yet know it. That night, as the hero lay in his cell, contemplating the coming trial, as he perhaps questioned for the first time whether his confidence had been misplaced, a visitor was preparing to come to him. A visitor who carried with her the means for his salvation, and who would ask in return only one thing: that he take her with him when he fled, that he make her his wife and queen in Athens, that he repay her betrayal of her homeland with the promise of a new life at his side. It was a bargain that seemed simple enough at the time, but we know now that such bargains are never simple, that the gods watch such transactions with great interest, and that even the most heartfelt promises can be broken by the weakness of mortal hearts. A princess's betrayal for love. In the gathering darkness of that fateful evening, as shadows lengthened across the painted walls of Naxos and torches were lit in the palace corridors, Ariadne found herself unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything except the young man she had seen standing in chains before her father's throne. Her handmaidens noticed her distraction, the way she would start and stare into the middle distance, the flush that rose to her cheeks when she thought no one was watching. They exchanged knowing glances, for they had seen such symptoms before. Their princess was in love, and from the intensity of her reaction, this was no ordinary infatuation. This was the kind of passion that changed lives, that toppled kingdoms, that the poets would sing about for generations to come. But Ariadne's thoughts were not just of romance and possibility. They were also practical, urgent, and darkly desperate. Tomorrow, perhaps the day after, Theseus and the other tributes would be sent into the labyrinth. Once those massive doors closed behind them, once they stepped into that first corridor, with its oppressive walls and its air thick with the fear of countless previous victims, they would be lost. The labyrinth was Daedalus's masterwork, an architectural puzzle so complex that even its creator sometimes struggled to navigate it. The passages twisted back on themselves led to dead ends that looked like throughways, created optical illusions that made it impossible to judge distances or directions. In the darkness, without any point of reference, a person would wander until they collapsed from exhaustion, or until the Minotaur's sensitive hearing picked up the sound of their footsteps, and the creature came hunting through the maze with the patience of a predator who knew its prey could never escape. Ariadne knew the labyrinth better than most, for she held a special position in relation to it. Some ancient sources called her the mistress of the labyrinth, suggesting that she had certain duties or authority regarding the maze and what happened within it. She knew where the entrance was, of course, and she knew stories about its construction and design. More importantly, she knew the one person in all of Crete who understood the labyrinth's secrets completely. Daedalus himself, the master craftsman, who had built both the maze and the wooden cow that had made Ariadne's half-brother's conception possible. If anyone could tell her how to help Theseus survive the labyrinth, it would be Daedalus. But approaching the craftsman required care. Daedalus was held in a complicated position at Minos's court. He was valued beyond measure for his skills and intelligence, but he was also, in a sense, a prisoner. Minos had made certain that Daedalus could not leave Crete, for the king feared what might happen if the man who understood the labyrinth's secrets was allowed to share that knowledge with others, or use it against Crete. Daedalus dwelt in comfortable enough quarters, with access to materials and assistance for his projects, but he was watched, and everyone knew it. Any conversation with him might be reported back to the king. Any unusual request might raise suspicions. Nevertheless, Ariadne went to him. She must have done so under some pretext, perhaps consulting him about some artistic project or technical question that a princess might reasonably bring to the palace craftsman. But once they were alone, or as alone as two such closely watched people could be, she revealed to him her true purpose. She told him about Theseus, about the overwhelming feelings that had struck her like lightning from a clear sky, about her desperate need to save this young hero from the death that awaited him in the maze. And she asked Daedalus the question that would seal all their fates. How could someone enter the labyrinth and find their way back out again? Imagine Daedalus's dilemma in that moment. He was a man who had already been complicit in several of the tragedies that had befallen the house of Minos. He had built the wooden cow that had allowed Pasiphae to conceive the Minotaur. He had designed the labyrinth that now served as both prison and killing ground. He had, through his own cleverness and his, perhaps, overeager willingness to solve any problem put to him, regardless of the consequences, contributed to the sufferings of everyone involved in this dark tale. And now, here was the king's daughter, asking him to betray his master by revealing the one secret that Minos most wanted kept hidden. If Daedalus helped Ariadne, and if Minos discovered it, the consequences would be severe. Daedalus might find himself in his own labyrinth, or worse. But perhaps Daedalus had grown weary of the role he had played in so much suffering. Perhaps he felt that he owed some debt to the universe for the harm his creations had caused. Or perhaps he simply recognized in Ariadne's eyes the same desperate determination he had seen in her mother's eyes when Pasiphae had begged him to help her satisfy her cursed desire. And he knew that refusal would be futile. Whatever his reasons, Daedalus agreed to help. And his solution was elegant in its simplicity. He gave Ariadne a ball of thread, the kind that might be used in weaving. A common enough object that no one would question a princess carrying it. But this was no ordinary thread, he explained. This thread could be used to create a path through the labyrinth, a lifeline back to the entrance that no amount of darkness or confusion could obscure. The plan was simple. Theseus would tie one end of the thread to the door at the entrance to the labyrinth. Then, as he ventured deeper into the maze, he would unwind the thread behind him, letting it trail through the passages as he searched for the Minotaur. When his task was complete, when the beast lay dead and the danger was past, he would only need to follow the thread back to find his way to the entrance and freedom. It required no complex knowledge of the maze's layout, no careful memorization of turns and landmarks. It simply required that one hold on to the thread and follow where it led. Of course, there was still the small matter of surviving the confrontation with a supernatural creature of immense strength and savage fury. But that was Theseus's concern. Daedalus was providing the means of escape from the maze itself, not a guarantee of survival against what dwelled within it. Ariadne took the ball of thread, which would later be called the clue in English, giving us the word clue that we still use today for anything that helps solve a mystery or find a path through a difficult problem. But along with the thread, she knew she needed to give Theseus something else, a weapon. The tributes were sent into the labyrinth unarmed, the better to ensure that they could offer no resistance to the Minotaur. But Theseus would need a blade if he was to have any hope of killing the creature. Ariadne managed to procure a sword, smuggling it from the palace armory, or perhaps taking one of her father's own weapons. In some versions of the tale, she also provided a sword and specific instructions on how to fight the beast, advice that she had perhaps learned from Daedalus or from observing the Minotaur herself during the times when servants brought food into the labyrinth's outer passages. With these precious gifts secured, Ariadne now faced the most dangerous part of her plan, approaching Theseus directly. The tributes were being held in cells within the palace, guarded, but not heavily so. For where could they escape to? Ariadne used her position as a princess to gain access to these areas, perhaps claiming she wished to pray for the victims' souls, or to see for herself those who would soon die in the darkness below. The guards bowed to her authority and allowed her to pass. And so she came to the cell where Theseus was confined, this young man who had so suddenly and completely captured her heart. Imagine that meeting, that conversation conducted in urgent whispers with the knowledge that discovery could mean death, or worse, for both of them. Ariadne approached the bars of Theseus's cell, and he looked up to see her standing there, this beautiful princess whom he had noticed during the presentation before King Minos. But she was not there to gloat over a condemned prisoner or to satisfy some morbid curiosity. She was there to offer him life. She held out the ball of thread and the sword, and in a rush of words, she explained what they were and how he could use them to survive the labyrinth. She told him about tying the thread to the entrance, about following it back, about striking quickly and decisively at the Minotaur before the creature could use its superior strength against him. And then she told him her price. She could not stay in Crete after this betrayal, she explained. Once her father learned what she had done, her life would be forfeit. She needed Theseus to take her with him when he and the other tributes fled the island. More than that, She needed him to marry her, to make her his wife and queen in Athens, to give her a new home and a new identity far from the land she was betraying. It was a heavy request, fraught with implications. Theseus would be binding himself to a woman he barely knew, taking on the obligation of protecting and providing for someone who had just proven herself capable of betraying her own family for love. But what choice did he really have? Without her help, he would die in the labyrinth along with all the others. With her help, he might live, might triumph, might return to Athens as the hero he had always known he was meant to be. Some versions of the story suggest that Theseus fell in love with Ariadne in that moment, that the attraction was mutual and immediate, a genuine meeting of souls that made the bargain less of a transaction and more of a joyful commitment between two people who recognized in each other their perfect match. Other versions are less romantic, portraying Theseus as a man who made a promise he perhaps never truly intended to keep, or who made it in the moment with all sincerity, but without fully considering what it would mean to fulfill it. The truth, if there was ever a single truth to such a tale, is lost to time. But Theseus gave his word. He swore to Ariadne that if she helped him survive the labyrinth, he would take her as his wife, that they would sail away together to Athens, where she would be honored as a queen and cherished as the woman who had saved the city's children from death. Ariadne passed the thread and the sword through the bars of the cell, and Theseus took them, feeling the weight of both in his hands, feeling the solidity of the weapon and the surprising lightness of the thread that would be his salvation. Their fingers touched briefly through the bars, and in that touch passed an electric current of promise and possibility. She gave him a few more whispered instructions, told him when the tributes would be sent into the labyrinth, explained the layout of the palace so he would know which way to run once they emerged. Then, before the guards could grow suspicious of her prolonged absence, Ariadne slipped away into the shadows, leaving Theseus alone with his thoughts and his new hope. That night must have been the longest of Ariadne's life. She lay in her chambers, unable to rest, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong. What if the guards discovered the sword hidden in Theseus's cell? What if her father somehow learned of her betrayal before the plan could be executed? What if Theseus was killed by the Minotaur, despite all her help? What if he succeeded, but then decided to sail away without her, leaving her to face her father's wrath alone? Each possibility was more terrible than the last, and she had committed herself so fully to this course of action that there was no turning back. she had cast her lot with this stranger, this hero who had looked at her with such intensity. And now she could only wait and pray to whatever gods might listen that her choice would not destroy them both. For Theseus, that night was different. Yes, he faced the prospect of entering a deadly maze to fight a monster, but he had already faced death many times on his journey to Athens. What was different now was that he had a plan, a real chance at survival and victory. He examined the sword Ariadne had given him, testing its balance and edge. He studied the ball of thread, marveling at the simplicity of the solution it represented, and he thought about the woman who had given him these gifts, this princess who was willing to betray everything for him. Did he love her? He barely knew her, but he was grateful to her, certainly, and he had given his word. That would have to be enough for now. Tomorrow, he would enter the labyrinth. Tomorrow, he would face the Minotaur. And if the gods willed it, tomorrow he would emerge victorious, ready to claim both his triumph and his bride. Into the darkness, morning came with the terrible inevitability of fate. The sun rose over Crete, painting the white walls of Naxos in shades of gold and amber, beautiful and indifferent to the terror about to unfold beneath the palace. The 14 tributes were roused from their cells and given a simple meal, their last meal before entering the labyrinth. Some of them could not eat, their stomachs churning with fear. Others forced down every bite, clinging to the physical sustenance as a drowning person clings to driftwood, knowing it would have to last them through whatever ordeal awaited. Theseus ate steadily, his mind already in the maze, already planning, already preparing himself for what he would have to do. They were led from their cells through the palace corridors, past the curious and sometimes pitying stares of servants and courtiers. Word had spread through the palace that this group of tributes included a prince of Athens, a volunteer who had come not in resignation, but in defiance, claiming he would kill the Minotaur and end the tribute forever. Some dismissed this as the empty boasting of a doomed young man trying to maintain his courage in the face of certain death. Others wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, this time might be different. The tributes reached the great bronze doors that marked the entrance to the labyrinth, doors so massive that it took 4 strong men to swing each one open. Beyond those doors lay darkness, a darkness so complete that it seemed almost solid, a physical presence that resisted the light trying to penetrate it. King Minos was there to pronounce the ritual words that condemned them to their fate. He stood in his royal robes, his face stern and unmoved, and a king performing a necessary duty that he had performed many times before. If he noticed his daughter standing among the crowd of observers, if he saw the tension in her posture or the paleness of her face, he gave no sign. Ariadne watched with her heart hammering in her chest, her hands clutched together so tightly that her knuckles showed white. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to Theseus to do the rest. She watched as he was led forward with the others, watched as he cast one quick glance back in her direction, a glance that might have been meant for her, or might have been a final look at the world of light before descending into darkness. The tributes were ushered through the bronze doors. Theseus went last, his hand in his clothing where he had concealed the sword, his other hand holding the ball of thread. As he stepped across the threshold into the labyrinth, as he felt the cool, stale air that came from deep underground, he saw on the wall beside the door an iron ring set into the stone. This was what Ariadne had told him to look for. Without drawing attention to what he was doing, working as if he was simply steadying himself against the wall, he tied one end of the thread securely to the ring. The other tributes moved forward into the passageway, some calling out to each other in the darkness, already afraid of becoming separated. But Theseus held back for just a moment, ensuring the thread was secure, checking that it would unwind smoothly from the ball. Then, as the great bronze doors swung shut behind them, with a boom that echoed through the stone passages, like the voice of doom itself, Theseus turned and followed the others into the maze. The darkness was absolute. The labyrinth had no windows, no torches, no light of any kind. Those who entered were meant to wander blind until the Minotaur found them, and the beast, having lived its entire life in these passages, needed no light to hunt. It knew every corridor by touch and smell and sound, could sense the vibrations of footsteps through the stone floor, could hear the rapid breathing of terrified prey from passages away. The tributes called out to each other, trying to stay together, their voices echoing strangely in the enclosed space, coming back to them distorted and directionless, so that it became difficult to tell which way a shout had come from. Theseus moved carefully, letting the thread play out behind him, using his free hand to touch the wall and guide himself forward. He knew he could not stay with the other tributes. They would move randomly, panicking and running when they heard sounds in the darkness, and they would only draw the Minotaur's attention more quickly. his task was different. He needed to find the creature first, to confront it on his terms, rather than waiting in terror for it to find him. So as the voices of the others grew more distant, as they moved deeper into the maze, following their own desperate paths, Theseus turned down a different passage, descending deeper into the labyrinth's heart. The passages twisted and turned. Sometimes they widened into open spaces. Sometimes they narrowed until his shoulders nearly touched both walls. The floor was sometimes smooth stone, sometimes rough and uneven, occasionally slick with moisture that had seeped through from above. The air grew thicker the deeper he went, heavy with the smell of old blood and waste and something else, something animal and rank that made his instincts scream danger even before his mind could identify what he was smelling. That was the Minotaur's scent, the smell of the beast's lair somewhere in these dark passages. Theseus followed that smell the way a hunter follows a trail, moving carefully, silently, his hand now on the hilt of the sword, ready to draw it at the first sign of danger. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. Theseus could not tell if he had been walking for minutes or hours. The thread continued to play out behind him, and he took comfort in its presence, in the knowledge that whatever else happened, he could find his way back to the entrance. But first, he had to complete his mission. He had to find the Minotaur. And then, somewhere in the darkness ahead, he heard it, the sound of heavy breathing, deep and rhythmic, the breathing of something massive, the sound of hooves shifting on stone, and beneath it all, a low rumbling that might have been a growl or might simply have been the sound of the creature existing, its presence so powerful that it seemed to make the very air vibrate. Theseus stopped, every muscle tensed, listening. The creature was close, perhaps just around the next turn, perhaps in a chamber just ahead. He drew the sword, feeling its familiar weight in his hand, grateful beyond measure to Ariadne for providing him with this weapon. Without it, he would be facing this monster with nothing but his bare hands. And while he was strong, he was not strong enough for that. The Minotaur's breathing grew louder. It had heard him, was aware of his presence. The hunt, which had been all on one side until now, had become mutual. The beast was coming. The Minotaur emerged from the darkness like a nightmare made flesh. In the absolute blackness of the labyrinth, Theseus could not see it clearly, but he could sense its massive bulk, could hear the scrape of its hooves on stone, could feel the displacement of air as it moved. The creature was enormous, towering over him, its bull's head lowering as it prepared to charge. Theseus had fought many opponents, but never anything like this, never something that was both man and beast, that combined human intelligence with animal fury. The Minotaur roared, a sound that was neither fully human nor fully bovine, but something in between, something that sank of the creature's tortured existence, trapped between two natures and belonging fully to neither. Then it charged. Theseus heard the hooves thundering toward him and threw himself to the side, pressing against the wall as the massive form rushed past him. He lashed out with his sword as it passed, felt the blade connect with flesh, heard the creature bellow in pain and rage. But the wound was not mortal. And now the Minotaur knew where he was, knew that this prey was different, that this one had teeth. The beast turned in the narrow passage, its breathing harsh and angry. They circled each other in the darkness, each trying to sense where the other was, each waiting for an opening. The battle that followed was unlike anything Theseus had ever experienced. It was combat stripped of all the elements he was used to relying on, all the visual cues and strategic positioning that normally guided a fighter's decisions. Everything was sound and touch and instinct. The Minotaur would charge, and Theseus would dodge or duck, striking out when he could, always keeping his back to the wall so the creature could not get behind him. Sometimes he landed solid blows that drew roars of pain. Sometimes his sword struck only air as the beast moved faster than he anticipated. And sometimes the Minotaur's massive fists or its horns would catch him, glancing blows that sent him staggering, reminded him that one solid hit from this creature would be enough to crush bones and end the fight. But Theseus had something the Minotaur did not: purpose beyond simple hunger and rage. He was fighting not just for his own life, but for the lives of all the tributes who had come before him, for the freedom of Athens from this terrible obligation, for Ariadne, who had betrayed her family, to give him this chance. That purpose gave him strength when his muscles began to tire, gave him focus when the pain from his injuries threatened to overwhelm him. He fought with everything he had, with all the skill he had developed on his journey to Athens, with all the determination that had driven him to volunteer for this mission in the first place. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The Minotaur charged again, and this time Theseus did not dodge to the side. Instead, he dropped to one knee and held his sword straight up, braced against the stone floor. The creature, moving too fast to stop, impaled itself on the blade, driving it deep into its chest with the force of its own charge. The Minotaur bellowed, a sound of shock and pain, and something that might almost have been relief. As if some part of the creature was grateful that its tortured existence was finally ending. It staggered backward, pulling itself off the sword, and Theseus heard it collapse heavily to the floor. The breathing that had seemed so terrifying just moments before grew ragged, then weak, then finally stopped altogether. The Minotaur was dead. Theseus stood in the darkness, breathing hard, his body screaming with pain from a dozen wounds and bruises, but alive. He had done it. He had killed the beast that had terrorized Athens for so long. He wanted to shout his triumph, wanted to raise his sword to the heavens, but the heavens were hidden behind layers of stone, and he was still deep in the labyrinth, with the other tributes scattered throughout its passages. He sheathed his bloody sword and reached down to find the thread, his lifeline back to the world above. It was there, just where it should be, trailing back through the darkness in the direction from which he had come. He began to follow it, winding it back onto the ball as he went, retracing his steps through the passages that had seemed so threatening on the way in, but now felt almost welcoming, knowing that each turn brought him closer to freedom. He called out as he walked, shouting for the other tributes to follow his voice. In the darkness, his calls echoed strangely, but some of the tributes heard and came stumbling toward him, weeping with relief at hearing another human voice, hardly daring to hope that rescue had come. He gathered them to him, formed them into a line, with each person holding on to the one in front, and led them all following the thread that Ariadne had given him. Not all of the tributes could be found. Some had wandered too deep into the maze, or had collapsed from fear and exhaustion, or had simply run in the wrong direction when they heard Theseus's calls, thinking it was some trick of the Minotaur. But he saved most of them, leading this bedraggled line of survivors through the twisting passages, winding the thread as he went, until finally he saw ahead of him a thin line of light coming from around the great bronze doors. They had reached the entrance. Theseus and the surviving tributes pressed themselves against those massive doors, and when the guards outside opened them for the routine check that would be made before nightfall, expecting to find no one, or perhaps a few tributes, cowering just inside the entrance, they were instead rushed by a group of young people who burst out into the light like souls escaping from the underworld. Theseus was at their head, still gripping his bloody sword, his clothes torn and stained, his face set in lines of determination that brooked no opposition. The surprised guards barely had time to react before they were overwhelmed. Chaos erupted in the palace. Word spread rapidly that the tributes had escaped, that the Minotaur was dead, that the Athenian prince had done the impossible. Some saw it as a miracle, others as a disaster. But everyone understood that something fundamental had just changed. The tribute that had defined relations between Athens and Crete for a generation was over. But Theseus had no time to savor his victory or to confront King Minos. He had a promise to keep. And more immediately, he needed to get himself and the other Athenians off this island before Minos could rally his forces and prevent their escape. Ariadne had been waiting, watching for any sign of what had happened in the labyrinth. When she saw Theseus emerge, alive and victorious, when she saw him leading the other tributes out of the darkness, her heart soared with joy and relief and love. She ran to him, heedless of the eyes watching, heedless of propriety or her position. He saw her coming and reached out to her, and they embraced there in the midst of the chaos. Two people who had gambled everything on each other and won. But their reunion was brief. Theseus grasped her hand and pulled her with him as he and the tributes ran for the harbor. Behind them, she could hear her father's voice rising in rage, could hear orders being shouted, could hear the sound of pursuit beginning. But they had a head start, and desperation lent them speed. They reached the harbor where the black-sailed ship waited. The crew, loyal Athenians who had never expected to see their passengers return alive, were stunned, but quickly rallied to cast off the lines and push away from the dock. Ariadne leaped aboard with Theseus's help. And then they were moving, the oars digging into the water, driving them away from the shore. Behind them, soldiers were arriving at the docks, but too late. The ship was already pulling into open water, already turning its prow toward the horizon. Ariadne stood at the rail, watching her homeland recede, watching everything she had ever known fall away behind her. She was a traitor now, an exile, a woman without a country or a family. But she had Theseus, and she had his promise, and she had the intoxicating knowledge that she had chosen love over duty and survived the choosing. They sailed through the night and into the next day, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Crete. The tributes celebrated their survival, though their joy was tempered by grief for those who had not made it out of the labyrinth. Theseus moved among them, accepting their thanks and their praise, but his eyes kept returning to Ariadne, this woman who had made everything possible. She stood often at the rail, looking out at the sea, and perhaps she was thinking about what awaited her in Athens. Perhaps she was already beginning to feel the first small stirrings of doubt about the choice she had made. But mostly, in those early hours of their escape, there was only relief and the strange, giddy freedom that comes from having torn down your old life and built a new one from nothing but hope and daring. The ship made good progress, but even the strongest rowers need rest, and the vessel needed to take on fresh water. And so, as the sun began to set on their first full day of freedom, the ship approached an island, a small rocky place with a good harbor and a beach where they could make camp for the night. This island was called Naxos, and it was here, on these unremarkable shores, that one of mythology's greatest betrayals would unfold. It was here that Ariadne's story would take its darkest turn, and the love that had seemed so certain, so destined, would reveal itself to be far more fragile than anyone could have imagined. The island of Naxos, abandonment and heartbreak. The island of Naxos rose from the Aegean Sea like a jewel, larger and more lush than many of the rocky outcrops scattered throughout these waters. Its beaches were golden, its hills covered with vegetation that swayed in the warm breeze, and the harbor where the Athenian ship anchored seemed designed by the gods themselves for weary travelers seeking rest. The tributes came ashore with relief, their bodies still aching from their ordeal in the labyrinth, and their minds still processing the miracle of their survival. They gathered driftwood for fires, found freshwater springs in the hills, and began to prepare a meal, their first real meal since leaving Crete, their first meal as free people rather than condemned prisoners. Ariadne walked along the beach as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep crimson. Theseus walked beside her, his hand in hers, and they talked of the future that stretched before them. She asked him about Athens, about what the city was like, about the palace where she would live as his queen. He described it for her, told her about his father Aegeus, about the people who would welcome her as a hero for saving their children. He painted a picture of a life filled with honor and respect and love. And she believed him because she needed to believe him, because she had given up everything for this future he was describing. They sat together on the sand as darkness fell, watching the stars emerge one by one. And for a time, everything seemed perfect. But something was changing in Theseus, something subtle that Ariadne could not quite identify, but could sense in the way he would sometimes fall silent in the middle of a sentence, in the way his eyes would drift away from her toward the ship or the horizon. The truth was that Theseus, now removed from the immediate danger, and the overwhelming gratitude he had felt in those first moments after escaping the labyrinth, was beginning to have doubts. Not doubts about Ariadne herself, for she was as beautiful and brave as anyone could wish for, but doubts about the commitment he had made, about bringing a foreign princess to Athens as his bride, about the political complications this might create, about whether the hasty promise made in a desperate moment should really bind him for the rest of his life. The ancient sources offer different explanations for what happened next on the shores of Naxos, and perhaps all of them contain some element of truth. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and more painful than any of them admit. Some versions say that the god Dionysus appeared to Theseus in a dream that night, commanding him to leave Ariadne on the island because she was destined to become the god's bride. In this telling, Theseus is absolved of responsibility, merely following divine orders that he could not refuse. Other versions suggest that Theseus was advised by his companions that bringing Ariadne to Athens would be politically unwise, that the daughter of their enemy could never be fully trusted, that she might be a spy or a source of future conflict with Crete. Still other accounts claim that Theseus woke to find the ship being blown out to sea by sudden strong winds, that he tried to return to the island, but was prevented by the gods or the weather, that the abandonment was accidental rather than deliberate. But there is another version, darker and more honest, that suggests Theseus simply chose to leave her, that in the cold light of morning, faced with the reality of the promise he had made and the life it would commit him to, he made a decision that served his own interests rather than honoring his word. Perhaps he convinced himself that she would be better off on this pleasant island than in Athens, where she would always be viewed with suspicion as the daughter of Minos. Perhaps he told himself that he had already given her the gift of freedom from Crete, that this was sufficient repayment for her help. Or perhaps he made no excuses at all to himself, simply acted on the expedient choice and left the moral reckoning for later. We cannot know what passed through Theseus's mind as he made the decision that would define how history would remember him, not just as a hero who killed the Minotaur, but as the man who betrayed the woman who saved him. What we know is that when Ariadne woke on that beach, when she opened her eyes to the brightness of morning and reached out for Theseus, he was not there. She sat up, confused, thinking perhaps he had risen early and was somewhere nearby. She called his name, but only the sound of waves answered her. She stood and looked around, and her eyes fell upon the harbor. The ship was gone, the black-sailed vessel that had carried them from Crete, that held the other tributes, and the crew and everything she had connected to her new life had sailed away during the night while she slept, and Theseus had sailed with it, leaving her alone on this island with nothing but the clothes she wore and the terrible, crushing realization that she had been abandoned. Try to imagine the wave of emotions that must have crashed over her in that moment. First, surely, was disbelief. This could not be happening. There must be some explanation, some reason why the ship was gone. Perhaps they had moved to a different part of the island. Perhaps there had been some emergency that required them to sail around to the other side. She began to walk along the beach, searching, calling out, growing more desperate with each step that revealed only empty sand and empty sea. She climbed the hills to get a better view, scanned the horizon in every direction, but there was nothing. The ship was truly gone, and with it, every person she had any connection to in the world, every hope for the future she had imagined. The disbelief gave way to panic. She was alone on this island with no resources, no tools, no way to signal for help or to travel elsewhere. She had never been taught the skills that would help someone survive in such circumstances. She was a princess, raised in luxury, whose entire life had been spent within the protected confines of a palace. She knew nothing of finding food, or building shelter, or protecting herself from the elements. How long could she last here before starvation or exposure claimed her? And even if she somehow survived, what kind of life awaited her? She could never return to Crete, not after betraying her father and helping the Athenian tributes escape. She was truly alone in every sense of the word. The panic subsided into something deeper and more terrible. The understanding of what Theseus's abandonment meant. He had used her. He had accepted her help, had sworn to make her his wife, had looked into her eyes and made promises that she had believed with her whole heart. And then, when those promises became inconvenient, when she was no longer useful to him, he had simply left her behind like a piece of unwanted baggage. Everything she had sacrificed, her home, her family, her entire life, had been for nothing. The man she had fallen in love with, the hero she had saved, did not love her in return. Perhaps he never had. Perhaps it had all been calculated manipulation, the hero doing what was necessary to survive the labyrinth and escape Crete, with no intention of honoring his commitments once he was safely away. Ariadne sank down onto the sand and wept. She wept for her lost home, for the family she had betrayed, for the future that had been stolen from her. She wept for her own foolishness in trusting so completely, in believing that love could be as simple and pure as it had seemed in those first moments when their eyes met across King Minos's throne room. She wept until she had no more tears, until her body was exhausted from the violence of her grief. And then she simply lay there on the beach, staring at the empty horizon, wishing that she could die, that the gods would show her the mercy of ending her suffering. The ancient poets who told Ariadne's story lingered on this moment, painting it with all the pathos they could muster. They described her wandering the shoreline, calling Theseus's name to the uncaring sea. They described her tearing at her clothes and her hair in the traditional gestures of extreme mourning. They described her cursing Theseus, calling down the wrath of the gods upon the man who had broken his sacred oath to her. And perhaps she did all these things. Or perhaps she did none of them. Perhaps she simply sat very still and quiet, her mind unable to fully process the enormity of what had happened to her, her spirit broken beyond any outward expression of grief. What she could not know as she sat there in her despair was that her story was not over. What she could not see in her pain and her sense of betrayal was that sometimes when one door closes, another opens, that sometimes the worst betrayal can lead to an unexpected redemption. For the island of Naxos was not uninhabited, nor was it free from divine attention. Indeed, it was one of the favored places of a god who had his own complicated relationship with mortality and divinity, a god who understood what it meant to be caught between two worlds, a god who was drawn to those who had been rejected and abandoned by others. Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy and transformation, was coming to Naxos. And when he saw Ariadne weeping on the beach, everything would change once more. Divine intervention, Dionysus and redemption. Dionysus was a god unlike the others who dwelt on Mount Olympus. Born from the union of Zeus and the mortal princess Semele, he had experienced mortality in ways that most gods never did. His mother had been destroyed by Zeus's divine radiance before Dionysus was fully formed, and Zeus had sewn the premature infant into his own thigh to gestate until he could be born. Dionysus grew up among mortals, was driven mad by Hera's jealousy, wandered the earth as both man and god, and eventually earned his place among the Olympians. But he never forgot what it was like to suffer, to be rejected, to feel the pain of existence in ways that his more purely divine relatives could not understand. Perhaps that is why, when he came to Naxos and saw Ariadne in her abandonment and grief, his heart went out to her in a way that transcended simple desire or divine caprice. The accounts vary on exactly how Dionysus first encountered Ariadne. Some say he had been watching the events unfold, that he had seen Theseus and Ariadne arrive on his island, and had witnessed the hero's shameful abandonment during the night. Angered by this betrayal, Dionysus appeared to Ariadne as she wept, announcing himself and offering her comfort. Other versions suggest that Dionysus arrived later, coming to Naxos for his own reasons, perhaps to hold a festival or to visit the Maenads who sometimes accompanied him, and happened upon Ariadne by chance. But chance, or design, the result was the same. The god found the princess, and in that finding, both of their fates were transformed. Imagine Ariadne's shock when, looking up from her grief, she saw a figure approaching her on the beach. At first, she might have thought it was a hallucination brought on by her emotional distress, for the figure that walked toward her was both terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. Dionysus, in his divine form, was wreathed in grapevines and ivy, his dark hair crowned with leaves, his eyes reflecting depths of knowledge and experience that no mortal eyes could match. He was accompanied by a retinue of strange beings, satyrs with their goat legs and mischievous grins, Maenads in their ecstatic dancing, animals that seemed to obey his unspoken commands. The very air around him seemed to shimmer with divine power, and the smell of wine and flowers followed in his wake. But despite the overwhelming nature of his appearance, despite the fear that any mortal might reasonably feel when confronted by an Olympian god, Ariadne found herself not afraid, but transfixed. Perhaps it was because she had already lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to fear. Perhaps it was because something in Dionysus's eyes spoke to her pain, recognized it, understood it in a way that no one else could. Or perhaps it was simply that the gods sometimes choose mortals for reasons beyond human understanding. And when such a choice is made, the mortal has little power to resist or question it. Dionysus spoke to her, and his voice was like music, like the sound of wind through grapevines, like the laughter and tears that come from deep intoxication, all at once. He told her that he had seen what Theseus had done, and that the hero's betrayal had not gone unnoticed by the divine powers. He told her that she deserved better than to be cast aside by a mortal who lacked the vision to appreciate the gift he had been given. And then, in words that must have seemed impossible to Ariadne's despairing ears, he told her that he wanted her, that he had chosen her to be his bride, that if she would accept him, he would make her immortal, and she would reign at his side as a goddess. Consider what this offer must have meant to Ariadne in that moment. Just hours before, she had been abandoned on a beach, left to die alone and forgotten, a casualty of a mortal man's faithlessness. Now a god, one of the Olympians themselves, was offering her not just rescue, but apotheosis, not just survival, but divinity itself. It was beyond any dream she could have imagined, beyond any hope she could have held on to during those dark hours of grief. And yet, could she trust it? She had trusted Theseus, had believed his promises, and look where that had led her. How could she know that Dionysus would not similarly betray her once he tired of her or found someone more interesting? But Dionysus, god of transformation and ecstasy, of breaking down boundaries and transcending ordinary existence, was not Theseus. He was a being of immense power who had no need to lie or manipulate. If he desired Ariadne, it was not because he needed something from her, but simply because he wanted her. And what a god wants, a god can take without subterfuge or deception. The fact that he was asking, that he was giving her a choice rather than simply imposing his will, was itself a kind of gift, a recognition of her agency even in this moment of her greatest vulnerability. Ariadne accepted. What else could she do? Even if she had doubts, even if some part of her heart still ached for Theseus and the life she had imagined with him, she could not refuse the alternative that Dionysus offered. And perhaps, in accepting, she was also choosing herself in a way she had not done before. When she helped Theseus, she had been choosing him over her family and homeland. When she agreed to become Dionysus's bride, she was choosing a future for herself, a path that led upward rather than down into despair and death. The wedding of Dionysus and Ariadne became one of the great celebrations of Greek mythology, a festival attended by gods and nymphs and all manner of divine beings. Dionysus adorned Ariadne with a magnificent crown, a diadem worked in gold and set with jewels that sparkled like stars. This was no ordinary crown, but a divine artifact of immense beauty and power, worthy of a goddess. The wedding feast stretched on for days, with wine flowing endlessly, music that never ceased, and dancing that blurred the boundaries between exhaustion and ecstasy, between the physical and the transcendent. But the crown Dionysus gave Ariadne was destined for an even greater purpose than adorning a bride. After the wedding festivities concluded, the god took the crown and hurled it into the heavens, where it was transformed into a constellation. This is Corona Borealis, the northern crown, a circle of stars that still shines in the night sky as a permanent reminder of Ariadne's wedding and her transformation from abandoned mortal to immortal goddess. Astronomers and stargazers throughout history have looked up at that crown-shaped constellation and remembered the story of the princess who suffered betrayal but found redemption, who lost everything but gained immortality. As Dionysus's wife, Ariadne became associated with his mysteries and rites, his ecstatic celebrations, and his gift of wine to humanity. She was worshipped alongside him in temples throughout Greece and later in Rome, where she was known as Libera. Her cult emphasized themes of liberation, transformation, and the transcendence of suffering through divine intervention. In these stories, Ariadne was not merely a victim who had been rescued, but a powerful figure in her own right, a goddess who could help mortals navigate their own transformations and find meaning in their own suffering. Some ancient sources tell us that Ariadne bore children to Dionysus, divine offspring, who carried forward the legacy of their parents' unusual union. The most commonly mentioned are Oenopion, whose name connects him to wine, and Staphylos, whose name relates to grapes. These sons became kings and founders of cities, spreading their father's gift of viticulture throughout the Greek world. Through them, Ariadne's bloodline continued, merging the mortal heritage of Cretan royalty with the divine essence of Olympus, creating a bridge between the human and divine worlds that reflected her own transformation. But beyond the children and the constellation and the temples raised in her honor, what did Ariadne's transformation truly mean? In one reading, her story becomes a tale of how suffering can be the gateway to transcendence, how the darkest moments of betrayal and loss can paradoxically open doors to experiences and identities that would otherwise remain forever closed. The Ariadne who became a goddess was not the same as the naive princess who had helped Theseus escape the labyrinth. That Ariadne had died on the beach at Naxos, her innocence and trust shattered by abandonment. The Ariadne who rose as Dionysus's bride had been transformed by suffering into something stronger, wiser, and ultimately more powerful than she could have been if Theseus had kept his promise. In another reading, Ariadne's elevation to goddesshood represents a kind of cosmic justice, the universe correcting an imbalance created by Theseus's betrayal. The hero, who should have been grateful and honorable, instead chose expediency and faithlessness. And so, the woman he wronged was lifted up beyond his reach, beyond his world entirely, to a place where his actions could no longer touch her. every time Theseus looked up at the night sky and saw Corona Borealis shining down, he would be reminded of what he had lost, of the goddess he could have had as his queen had he only kept his word. Yet we must also acknowledge the troubling elements in this resolution to Ariadne's story. She was, after all, taken by a god. And while Dionysus offered her a choice and she accepted, we must remember the vast power imbalance that existed between them. How free was she, really, to refuse, alone and abandoned on that beach? And while becoming a goddess might seem like the ultimate happy ending, it also meant leaving behind her humanity, transforming into something fundamentally different from what she had been. The Ariadne who loved Theseus ceased to exist, replaced by a divine being whose perspective and concerns would necessarily be alien to mortal understanding. Is this transformation a reward or another kind of loss? The myths do not answer this question definitively, leaving us to wrestle with the ambiguity. What the myths do make clear is that Ariadne's story did not end with her abandonment on Naxos. She was not forgotten, not erased, not reduced to merely a footnote in Theseus's heroic narrative. Instead, she transcended that narrative entirely, becoming something greater than either the princess she had been or the queen she had hoped to become. Her story reminds us that sometimes the paths we choose for ourselves are not the ones we end up walking. That destiny has designs that may override our own desires, and that endings we perceive as tragic can contain within them the seeds of transformation and renewal. But what of Theseus? What became of the hero who killed the Minotaur, but abandoned the woman who made his victory possible? His story continued, but it was forever shadowed by what he did on Naxos, and the consequences of his betrayal would haunt him in ways he could not have anticipated when he sailed away from that island, leaving Ariadne to wake alone on its shore. The return to Athens. Tragedy. A tragedy. The black-sailed ship cut through the waters of the Aegean, making good time on its journey back to Athens. The crew and the rescued tributes were in high spirits, laughing and talking about the welcome that awaited them, about how they would be celebrated as heroes, about how their families would weep with joy to see them alive when everyone had assumed they were dead. They told and retold the story of what had happened in the Labyrinth, of Theseus's courage in facing the Minotaur, of their desperate flight from Crete. But in these retellings, Ariadne's role began to shrink, to be minimized, to be forgotten. It became a story about Theseus, the hero, rather than about the collaboration between the hero and the princess who betrayed her homeland for love. Theseus himself stood at the prow of the ship, staring ahead toward the horizon where Athens lay. What thoughts occupied his mind during this voyage? Did he think of Ariadne? Did he feel guilt for what he had done? Did he try to justify his actions to himself? The ancient sources are largely silent on this question, perhaps because the poets and playwrights who told his story were more interested in his actions than his internal life. Or perhaps because they could not imagine what kind of man could do what Theseus did, and then simply sail on as if nothing significant had occurred. But we can speculate that Theseus, having made his choice, was not the type to torment himself with regrets. He was a man of action, someone who moved forward rather than looking back, who accepted the consequences of his decisions without excessive self-examination. Yet there was one detail, one small but crucial element of his return to Athens, that Theseus had completely forgotten in the chaos of events following his escape from the Labyrinth. Before he had left Athens, before he had volunteered to join the tribute, his father Aegeus had made him promise something. The tribute ships always sailed with black sails, symbols of mourning for the young people being sent to their deaths. But Aegeus had given Theseus white sails to take with him, with instructions to raise them if he succeeded in his mission and survived the labyrinth. That way, Aegeus explained, he would be able to see from far off whether his son lived or had perished in the attempt. Theseus had agreed readily to this request. How could he forget something so simple? But he had forgotten. In the rush to escape from Crete, in the stop at Naxos, and all that had transpired there, in his preoccupation with his own thoughts and plans, Theseus had never given a single thought to changing the sails. The ship bore down on Athens under the same black sails it had left with, proclaiming to anyone who saw it that the mission had failed, that the tributes were dead, that Theseus was dead. And there was one person watching for that ship with more desperate intensity than anyone else in all of Athens. King Aegeus had spent the weeks since his son's departure in a state of barely controlled anxiety. He was an old man who had only recently discovered and acknowledged his son, only recently had the joy of knowing that his line would continue, that Athens would have a strong heir when his own time came to an end. The thought of losing Theseus to the Minotaur was almost unbearable, but he had been forced to let his son go, to allow him to pursue this dangerous course, because to prevent him would have been to break his spirit. So Aegeus waited, and he watched, and every day he would climb to the highest point in Athens, to the edge of the cliff that overlooked the sea, and scan the horizon for any sign of a returning ship. When at last the ship appeared, when Aegeus saw the dark speck on the horizon gradually resolve into a vessel making its way toward the harbor, his heart must have leaped with hope and dread in equal measure. He strained his old eyes, trying to make out the color of the sails, trying to see whether his son had succeeded or failed, whether Theseus lived or had died in the darkness of the labyrinth. And as the ship drew closer, as the sails became clearly visible, Aegeus saw black sails, black like mourning, black like death, black like the end of all his hopes. The despair that crashed over Aegeus in that moment was total and absolute. His son was dead. The boy he had only just come to know, the hero who had seemed destined for such greatness, had been killed by the Minotaur, just like all the other tributes who had been sent before him. Aegeus's line was ended. His bloodline would die with him, and Athens would have no strong heir when he passed. But more than all of that, more than the political concerns or dynastic worries, was the simple, terrible grief of a father who believes his son is dead. Aegeus felt his heart break, felt the weight of loss pressing down on him with such force that he could not bear it, could not stand under the burden of it. And so, standing there on the edge of the cliff with the black-sailed ship growing ever larger in his vision, King Aegeus stepped forward into empty air. He fell from that great height into the sea below, and the waters closed over him, ending his life in an instant. The sea that took his body would afterward be called the Aegean Sea, bearing his name through all the centuries to come, a permanent reminder of a father's grief and a son's tragic oversight. It stands as one of the great ironies of Greek mythology that Theseus, who had been so careful in the labyrinth, who had remembered to use Ariadne's thread to find his way back through the maze, who had defeated the Minotaur through strength and skill, should forget such a simple thing as changing the sails, and that this small forgetfulness should cost his father his life. When the ship finally docked in Athens, when Theseus and the tributes disembarked, expecting to be greeted with celebration and joy, they were instead met with mourning and chaos. The king was dead, they were told. He had thrown himself from the cliffs when he saw the black sails. Theseus's triumph over the Minotaur, his rescue of the tributes, his successful escape from Crete, all of it was immediately overshadowed by this terrible tragedy. The hero, who had set out to save his city, had returned, having inadvertently killed his own father. The joy that should have marked his homecoming was poisoned by grief. And Theseus found himself ascending to the throne of Athens, not in the manner he had imagined, as his father's proud heir, but as the man whose forgetfulness had caused the king's death. This moment represents a crucial turning point in how we understand Theseus as a character in Greek mythology. Up until this point, he had been the unblemished hero, the young man who defeated every challenge placed before him, who made the roads safe for travelers, who volunteered to face the Minotaur when no one else had the courage. But now we see revealed the darker aspects of his nature, the tendency toward thoughtlessness that would lead him to forget both his father's request and the woman who had saved his life. Theseus was a great hero, certainly, but he was also a deeply flawed man, someone whose strengths in combat and courage were matched by significant weaknesses in consideration and faithfulness. The guilt Theseus felt over his father's death is not extensively documented in the ancient sources, but it must have been considerable. This was not an enemy he had killed in battle or a monster he had slain to protect innocents. This was his own father, and the death had been caused not by any malicious intent, but by simple carelessness, by failure to remember a promise, by the same kind of thoughtlessness that had led him to abandon Ariadne on Naxos. Perhaps it was this guilt that drove some of his later actions as king of Athens, his attempts to prove himself worthy of the throne, his military campaigns and political maneuvers designed to make Athens the dominant power in the region. Or perhaps Theseus was simply the kind of man who, having caused a tragedy through his own oversight, chose to move forward rather than dwelling on what could not be changed. As king, Theseus did accomplish much that was genuinely admirable. He unified the various communities of Attica under Athenian rule, creating a stronger and more cohesive state. He established laws and institutions that would form the foundation of Athenian democracy in later generations. He led successful military campaigns and made Athens a power to be reckoned with in the Greek world. But all of his accomplishments could not erase what he had done, could not bring back his father or restore Ariadne to the life he had promised her. The black sails that he had forgotten to change became a metaphor for everything dark in his character, everything thoughtless and selfish that underlay the heroic exterior. And the consequences of his actions on Naxos were not yet finished playing out. Theseus would eventually marry again, would take a wife to be his queen in Athens. But the woman he chose for this honor was not some foreign princess from a distant land, or an Athenian noblewoman from a prominent family. No, the woman Theseus married was Phaedra, Ariadne's younger sister, another daughter of King Minos of Crete. Some sources suggest this marriage was political, a way of healing the breach between Athens and Crete that had been created by Theseus's killing of the Minotaur and his escape with the tributes. Others imply that Theseus was drawn to Phaedra specifically because she reminded him of Ariadne, that in marrying the sister, he was trying to recapture or replace what he had lost through his own faithlessness. But if this was his intention, it was doomed to fail in the most tragic way possible. The gods, it seemed, were not yet finished exacting payment for Theseus's betrayal of Ariadne. The curse of the house of Minos, the same divine displeasure that had afflicted Pasiphae with her unnatural passion for the white bull, would manifest again in Phaedra, and its target would be Theseus's own son from a previous marriage, a young man named Hippolytus. The story of Phaedra and Hippolytus is its own tragedy, one that ends in death and destruction for everyone involved. But it can be seen as the universe's way of ensuring that Theseus paid a full price for what he did on the shores of Naxos. By bringing Ariadne's sister into his home, he invited in the very forces of fate and divine retribution that he perhaps thought he had escaped. Echoes and aftermath. The enduring legend. The marriage of Theseus and Phaedra began, like many political marriages, with hopes for stability and alliance. Crete and Athens, having been enemies for so long, could finally establish friendly relations through this union. Phaedra came to Athens as a young bride, beautiful like her sister Ariadne had been, but perhaps carrying within her a certain wariness, a knowledge of what had happened to her sister, and a determination not to suffer the same fate. She bore Theseus 2 sons, Acamas and Demophon, and for a time things seemed to settle into a normal pattern of royal life and duty. But Theseus had a son from an earlier liaison with an Amazon queen, a boy he had named Hippolytus. This young man had grown into a handsome youth, devoted to the virgin goddess Artemis, and famously uninterested in the romantic pursuits that occupied most young men of his age. He spent his time hunting, training with weapons, and worshipping at Artemis's temples, maintaining a purity and aloofness that Aphrodite, the goddess of love, found deeply offensive. How dare this mortal boy reject the domain of love and desire, reject the fundamental force that Aphrodite represented? And so Aphrodite, in her divine anger, crafted a punishment that would destroy not only Hippolytus, but everyone connected to him. She caused Phaedra to fall desperately, overwhelmingly, impossibly in love with her stepson. This was not natural attraction, or even ordinary, inappropriate desire. This was a divine curse, a passion that consumed Phaedra's every waking moment, that made her ill with longing, that drove her to the edge of madness. She knew the desire was wrong, knew that it violated every law and custom that governed civilized behavior, but she could not control it, could not suppress it, could not escape from the terrible hunger that Aphrodite had planted in her heart. Eventually, unable to bear the suffering any longer, Phaedra revealed her feelings to Hippolytus. His reaction was one of horror and disgust. He rejected her advances absolutely, recoiling from her as if she were something contaminated and vile. His words to her were harsh, cutting, designed to make clear that he wanted nothing to do with her and that he considered her proposition an abomination. For Hippolytus, devoted to Artemis and her ideals of purity, the very idea of such a relationship was anathema, and he made certain that Phaedra understood exactly how revolting he found her. Phaedra, already tormented by the unnatural desire that had been inflicted upon her, now found herself facing rejection and shame. In her despair and fury, she made a terrible decision. She would destroy Hippolytus, since she could not have him. She wrote a letter to Theseus, claiming that Hippolytus had attempted to rape her, that he had violated the sanctity of his father's house and his father's marriage. Then, before Theseus could return to verify her claims or question her story, Phaedra hanged herself, leaving her body and the letter to be discovered together as apparent proof of the truth of her accusations. Theseus, finding his wife dead and reading her final letter, was consumed with rage. He did not pause to question, did not seek to hear his son's side of the story, did not consider that there might be more to these events than appeared at first glance. He had at his disposal a powerful curse, one of 3 wishes that had been granted to him by the god Poseidon. In his anger and grief, Theseus used one of these precious wishes to curse his own son, calling upon Poseidon to destroy Hippolytus for his supposed crime. The god obliged with terrible efficiency. As Hippolytus drove his chariot along the coastal road, Poseidon sent a massive bull rising from the sea. The creature's sudden appearance terrified Hippolytus's horses, causing them to bolt in panic. The chariot overturned, and Hippolytus was dragged along the rocky ground, his body torn and broken. By the time he was freed from the wreckage, he was dying. And although Artemis appeared to reveal the truth to Theseus, to explain that Hippolytus had been innocent and that Phaedra had lied, this knowledge came too late to save the young man's life. Hippolytus died in his father's arms, another victim of the cycle of deception, passion, and vengeance that seemed to follow Theseus like a curse. The parallels between this tragedy and what had happened with Ariadne are striking and surely intentional in the way the myth developed over time. Both stories involve Theseus making a promise or commitment. Both involve betrayal or abandonment. Both result in terrible consequences that Theseus could not have foreseen, but should have been able to prevent through greater care and consideration. By bringing Phaedra into his home, by marrying Ariadne's sister without apparently considering what emotional or supernatural complications this might create, Theseus had set in motion a chain of events that would destroy his family and leave him isolated in his old age, having lost both his sons and his wife to tragedies that all traced back, in one way or another, to his own actions and choices. The playwrights of Athens, particularly Euripides, in his tragedy Hippolytus, used these stories to explore profound questions about passion, honor, divine intervention in mortal affairs, and the consequences of human failings. In Euripides' telling, both Phaedra and Hippolytus are sympathetic characters, both trapped by forces beyond their control, both destroyed by the collision between divine manipulation and human nature. Theseus, in this version, comes across as a man who acts too quickly, who lets his emotions override his judgment, who destroys what he loves through his own rashness. It is a damning portrait of the hero who had once been celebrated as Athens's greatest champion. But let us return our focus to Ariadne, whose story had diverged from Theseus's trajectory long before these later tragedies unfolded. While Theseus struggled with the consequences of his choices, while he dealt with the guilt of his father's death, and eventually with the horror of having cursed his innocent son, Ariadne lived on as an immortal goddess, forever young, forever beautiful, forever beyond the reach of mortal concerns. The myths tell us that she was happy with Dionysus, that their marriage was one of genuine love and mutual respect, that she found in divine existence a fulfillment and purpose that she never could have achieved as a mortal queen in Athens. Various Greek cities and islands claimed special connections to Ariadne, maintaining shrines and festivals in her honor. On Naxos itself, where she had been abandoned and then redeemed, the people celebrated her story through ritual reenactments that honored both her suffering and her ultimate triumph. These festivals often involved elements associated with Dionysus, wine, and ecstatic dancing, and the blurring of boundaries between the human and the divine. Participants would recreate Ariadne's despair, and then her joy, moving through grief to celebration, death to rebirth, embodying in their own experiences the transformation that Ariadne herself had undergone. In art throughout the ancient world, and continuing through the Renaissance and into modern times, Ariadne became a popular subject for painters and sculptors. They depicted her in various moments of her story, offering the thread to Theseus, sleeping on the beach at Naxos, waking to find herself abandoned, being discovered by Dionysus, being crowned as his bride. Each artistic interpretation emphasized different aspects of her character and experience, but most focused on the contrast between her vulnerability as an abandoned mortal and her power as a goddess, between the despair of betrayal and the joy of divine love. The abandoned Ariadne became, in many ways, an archetype, a template for understanding how suffering can lead to transformation, how endings can become beginnings, how what appears to be the worst moment of one's life can paradoxically open doors to possibilities that would otherwise have remained forever closed. Her story resonates across cultures and centuries because it speaks to fundamental human experiences: the pain of betrayal, the struggle to trust again after being hurt, the question of whether we can truly overcome our past traumas or whether they define us forever. Modern psychological interpretations of the Ariadne myth have explored it as a narrative about female empowerment and the claiming of divine identity separate from male definition or validation. In this reading, Theseus's abandonment, while painful, was actually necessary for Ariadne to discover her true self and her true destiny. Had she gone to Athens and become Theseus's mortal queen, she would have remained dependent on him, defined by her relationship to him, forever in his debt, and therefore never quite equal. By being abandoned, by being forced to confront the reality that Theseus did not love her as she loved him, Ariadne was freed to discover a different path, one that led not to subordination within a mortal marriage, but to equality within a divine partnership. Feminist scholars have pointed out that Ariadne's transformation from helper maiden to goddess represents a subversion of typical heroic narratives, where women exist primarily to facilitate male achievement and then fade from the story. Ariadne refuses to fade. She is betrayed, yes, but she is also redeemed and elevated, becoming ultimately more important and more powerful than the hero who abandoned her. Her constellation shines in the heavens, visible to all, while Theseus's legacy is forever tainted by his faithlessness. In this sense, Ariadne's story becomes one of justice served, of the universe correcting an imbalance, of a woman claiming power on her own terms. Yet we must also acknowledge the complexity and ambiguity that resists simple readings of empowerment or justice. Ariadne did not choose her transformation, at least not in the initial moment. It was offered to her by Dionysus at a point when she had no real alternative, when she was vulnerable and alone and desperate. Can we truly call it empowerment when the rescue comes from another powerful male figure, even if that figure is a god rather than a mortal? Does replacing dependence on Theseus with union with Dionysus really represent independence, or just a different form of relationship? These questions do not have easy answers, and perhaps that is part of what makes Ariadne's story continue to fascinate us. It resists simple moral lessons, instead offering a rich tapestry of possibility and interpretation. The thread that Ariadne gave to Theseus has become, in our language and our collective imagination, a symbol for any tool or insight that helps us navigate complex problems or find our way through difficult situations. When we talk about finding the thread of an argument or following a thread through a complicated issue, we are unconsciously invoking Ariadne's gift, her solution to the seemingly unsolvable problem of the labyrinth. In this way, she remains present in our discourse, her intelligence and resourcefulness acknowledged every time we use these metaphors, even by people who may not know the original story. The crown that Dionysus threw into the heavens, creating the constellation Corona Borealis, serves as a permanent reminder of Ariadne's story. Astronomers have mapped those stars, given them designations and categories, measured their distances and compositions. But the pattern they form is still called the Northern Crown, still bears the name and shape that commemorate a god's love for a mortal woman. On clear nights, when you look up and find that circle of stars, you are seeing what Dionysus saw fit to immortalize, the crown he placed on Ariadne's head as he made her his bride. It is a love letter, written in starlight, visible across millennia, outlasting empires and civilizations, and all the human dramas that have played out beneath its gaze. Some scholars have suggested that the Ariadne myth preserves memories of actual historical events or cultural transitions. Perhaps there really was a princess of Minoan Crete who helped foreigners escape from the island, leading to political consequences for her family. Perhaps the story reflects the historical shift in power from Minoan Crete to Mycenaean Greece, with Ariadne representing Cretan civilization and Theseus representing the Greek invaders who would eventually dominate the region. Perhaps the various elements of the myth, the labyrinth, the Minotaur, the sacrificial tributes, all contain distorted memories of real religious practices or political arrangements that we can no longer fully reconstruct. These historical theories are speculative but they remind us that myths often contain within them fragments of truth, real experiences, and real cultural transitions that have been transformed through countless retellings into the stories that have come down to us. What remains undeniable is that the story of Ariadne and Theseus continues to speak to us across the vast distance of time that separates our world from the world in which these myths first took shape. We may not believe in the literal existence of the Minotaur or the physical reality of gods like Dionysus, but we understand the emotional and psychological truths that these stories encode. We understand what it means to help someone we love only to be betrayed by them. We understand the pain of abandonment and the struggle to rebuild our lives after devastating loss. We understand the transformative power of love, both mortal and divine, and the ways that suffering can sometimes lead us to become something greater than we were before. The tragic romance of Ariadne and Theseus is ultimately a story about the gap between promise and performance, between what we say we will do and what we actually do when tested. Theseus promised to take Ariadne as his wife, promised to honor her for the sacrifice she made. But when the moment came to keep that promise, he chose not to. Whether his reasons were political expediency, divine command, or simple callousness, the result was the same. A woman who had given everything for love was left with nothing, abandoned on a beach to face an uncertain fate. But it is also a story about redemption and transformation, about how the worst moments of our lives can become, in retrospect, the necessary preconditions for our greatest achievements. If Theseus had kept his promise, Ariadne would have gone to Athens and lived out her life as a mortal queen. She would have been remembered, if at all, as a footnote in someone else's story. The woman who helped Theseus kill the Minotaur. Instead, because of the betrayal, because of the abandonment on Naxos, she became a goddess. She became immortal. Her crown shines in the heavens, visible to all, a permanent reminder that sometimes our tragedies contain within them the seeds of our transcendence. As we close this journey through one of Greek mythology's most enduring tales, we are left with questions that may not have clear answers. Was Ariadne's transformation truly a happy ending? Or was it a different kind of loss, a trading of one identity for another? Was Theseus a hero whose flaws were simply part of his humanity? Or was he fundamentally dishonorable, using people and discarding them when they were no longer useful? Can betrayal ever be justified? Or do we always bear responsibility for the promises we make, regardless of how circumstances change? These are not questions the myths answer for us. Instead, they invite us to wrestle with them ourselves, to bring our own experiences and values to these ancient stories, and find in them whatever truths resonate with our own lives. What the myths do tell us clearly and consistently is that actions have consequences, that betrayals echo across time, that the gods watch and remember, and that sometimes what it appears to be the end is actually a beginning. Ariadne's story did not end on the beach at Naxos, though it must have felt to her in that moment like everything was over. Instead, that moment of utter despair became the threshold to a new existence, one that would lift her beyond mortality and make her name remembered not as a victim, but as a goddess. And so, we remember her, more than 3,000 years after the myths first took shape, as the woman who held the thread that led through darkness, as the princess who chose love over duty, as the goddess who wears a crown of stars. Her story continues to be told because it speaks to something eternal in the human experience, because we recognize in her journey our own struggles with trust and betrayal, with love and loss, with despair and hope. The thread she gave to Theseus can be seen as a metaphor for the stories themselves, the myths that guide us through the labyrinth of human existence, showing us paths through the darkness and leading us, if we follow them faithfully, toward understanding. If you enjoyed this journey through the tragic romance of Ariadne and Theseus, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Myths of the Night for more explorations of Greek mythology's greatest love stories. In our next episode, we'll be diving into another tale of passion and tragedy, examining how the gods and mortals navigate the complicated terrain of the heart. Until then, sleep well, dream of ancient heroes and the women who loved them, and remember that even in our darkest moments, transformation remains possible. The stars are watching, and perhaps somewhere among them, a crown still shines, reminding us that love, though it may wound us deeply, can also lift us to heights we never imagined possible.